So this is kind of like a little notebook that I have like as a general, like for all your module projects. All your module projects basically will have those 4 parts: your technical notebook, your non-technical presentation, a recording of your non-technical presentation, and a blog post. That goes all the way through up to your capstone. So by the end of this, was it 10 months, for part-time and everything like that, you're going to guys be masters of this stuff. It's going to be like nothing to you guys. In fact, I just had a few people do capstones, and a couple of them were just like, this capstone doesn't feel like super like big and like grandiose. I'm like, yeah, because you've been doing this for so long. Like it just is going to feel a lot more natural because you've been doing so much. Not to say their capstones weren't like great and amazing. It's just that they're just used to doing that kind of like parts, and it just becomes a little easier to do. Okay. So one quick thing, turning in your notebook. So you will need to turn in your turn in via Learn, so like learn.co, and I can help you guys out with this, but like you find it on the final project, and then you know how like on the side usually say you click done, you'll see on the project there's like parts you can turn in, and it's something like, I can't remember the exact things, like your GitHub repo, your blog post, and I think it's like the video recording or something along those lines. But those 3 parts, you need to turn that in before our one-on-one assessment. So make sure that you guys have, like it says on the curriculum, you really should have it turned in 24 hours before. I'm gonna say I'm gonna stick with that. Is that like if you schedule an assessment with me on Tuesday and it's not in like on that Tuesday morning, I'm gonna say, you know what, maybe we should reschedule. Like, are you sure you're all set and done? So this way you can it kind of helps you take a little bit of breath too. Like I've had people in the past, to be honest, try to do their assessment right after, like literally to the minute they finished it. And I'm like, why? We got time. We can take another, day and like do it the next day. So make sure you turn it in beforehand. That also gives me a chance to quickly look through it. So just double check if there's something missing so I can let you guys know. So when you turn in on, Learn, it doesn't ping me or let me know that you turned it in. So if you just send me a quick message like, hey, Victor, I turned in, my thing, can you take a look at it? I can check it out and make sure everything's there. Nothing weird happens, or like, oh, it looks like you forgot this piece or something. Like, oh, like it looks like you're missing this thing. Do this before the assessment. That kind of helps you out too. Okay. And note that you have to have all of the elements. Sometimes it's really easy to focus on like just the technical or even like the non-technical, depending, how you feel about different things, but you need to have the blog post as well. So just know that you have to have all 4 pieces there. Okay, cool. Sound good, everyone? All right, awesome. So let's talk about the different pieces. So the big one is the notebook, right? So in the notebook, the Jupyter notebook, right? Basically, this is kind of like you doing most of your work. You're going to spend almost all of your time doing the Jupyter notebook piece, right? So there's some things to kind of keep in mind. So one is that keep the data science life cycle. So, hey, remember this circle right here? I know Eli also loves this circle as well. I like to steal it from him every once in a while. But this project is really going to focus on like these, I guess it's technically 4 parts. I guess you can start with number 1, because that's like the first part, like why are you doing this project? And then the data mining, data cleaning, right? So that's kind of like data acquisition, I call it, right? Doing APIs, web scraping. Even if you have the data, you still have to usually clean it, make it into a form that makes sense and stuff like that. So you're going to do these parts first, right? And then the data exploration. So this is really like the big meat of like you're exploring the data and trying to find insights and things that are actionable for your business, for your stakeholders. Okay. And I like saying stakeholders because it doesn't have to be business. It just has to be people who have to care about this specific thing. Note that I put awesome and crisp DM. We talked about crisp DM a little bit, right? No? Okay, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in the future. This is a little bit on the older side of what I had before. But note that basically, if you think of the data science lifecycle, that's what awesome and crisp DM basically are. There's some variation of this kind of overall circle. Okay, so just keep this in mind of what you're doing. Okay, and it'll kind of help you keep like things organized. You're like, oh, I'm acquiring the data, I am reading the data, I am cleaning the data, I am exploring the data. If you kind of break it down at least like, mentally in your Jupyter notebook that way, it'll keep you kind of like from having to bounce around in different places. All right, cool. All right, so one thing to do is keep your notebook clean and organized, right? So document stuff. So use markdown cells to explain what you're trying to achieve and investigate. So one thing I'm gonna really quickly put is a lot of people, a lot of data scientists and a lot of programmers will put like a lot of their explanation and like almost like think paragraphs in their comments we got Jupyter notebooks. Like we're more advanced than just putting like notes in our comments and stuff. You can actually use a markdown cell and really write down like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs even, and really like write that in there. And that really stands out more than the code, because that way also, if you're showing parts of this to a non-technical person, note that the technical notebook is supposed to be from someone who's supposed to be about like data minded kind of person, but it does stick out better. And what's really cool is with the Jupyter notebook, you can basically export this stuff, like let's say in another, wherever you work, you can export this out and just get rid of all of the code and just show your markdown cells in your visualizations, which can be super useful because then you don't have to reinvent the wheel when you're presenting, like talking to someone who's non-technical. So get on a good practice of using the markdown cells to basically explain what you're doing and what insights you have. Like if you have like some, like let's say you do an exploratory visualization. Underneath that exploratory visualization, I really think you should have a markdown cell that says, hey, what's cool about that visualization? Like, why is it here? What did we find about it? And talk about it underneath there in a markdown says like, hey, like we can see that, for example, like most movies, let's say you have some graph that's broken down by like category or something like that. It's like, oh, most, superhero movies have, this amount of, revenue and whatnot compared to this movie. It's like, those are kind of insights. Like, and then you can even say things like, what I like to say is like, that narrative's like leads like, okay, like, well, that's really interesting. Can we break down, like maybe I say in this markdown cell, can we break this down further into different categories of superhero movies, to see if there's a deeper pattern in there. And I'd write that in the markdown cell, kind of like my thoughts down on paper, and then proceed forward. Does that make sense to people? Okay, cool. And then the rest of this is much more like coding stuff, right? So use functions. If you're using it more than once and you're copying and pasting the cell, take the time to write a function to basically do that thing over and over again. And it's a little bit readable too. Make sure your functions are readable. They have, when I say readable, like they're not just like fun or F or like does stuff, like those kind of functions. Make sure your function's readable and understandable. So someone looking at it, even if they have no clue what the function does, they can get an idea just by looking at it. And then, using comments and doc strings within your functions to document this. I will say is that I want everyone here, if you write a function that you're using, I want a doc string in there. I want something that says documents of what that is, because that is something that a lot of people like tend to neglect, and it's so useful. And if someone looks over your code, like let's say a recruiter or something like that, and they see you have a doc string, they're like, oh my gosh, we need to hire this person, because like they're going to document their code and we don't have to like go search and ask them. Like I'm not joking about this, is that I've worked for places like maybe this almost 3 years ago. 3 years ago, like I worked with someone, and they called me up like a year later, and they said like, hey, like we're looking at your code and they're looking at this function, like, like what does it do? And like, did you read the doc string? And they're like, oh, sweet. And like, yeah, and most people don't put that stuff in there. Like, it's like, I'm like, you call them up like a year later then to ask them like what they wrote? Like, I don't remember what I wrote. So know that's the common practice, including in data science. So if you put your comments in doc strings, it's going to make your life a lot easier, and it's going to make you look a lot more impressive. Okay. Document. A comment a day will keep long debugging sessions at bay. I made that up. I might have heard something like it. It sounds pretty good. Stick it on a bumper sticker. Comment stuff. Okay. And your comments explain what your code does. So note that basically if your code's a little kind of like clunky, right, with like the for loops or, like a list comprehension, put a comment that says what that thing is. And that way it's really easy for someone to very quickly read that comment and says, oh, they don't need to read the whole code and understand exactly what's going on. They can read that comment and says, oh, that's what it's doing. You don't need to necessarily like put a comment every single line you have, but I will tell you is that I would rather have the person who is like over excited about using comments than someone who never uses comments. So just, take that in mind. Let's see here. Oh, this is where I'll say is that one of the strategy that I use, like when I program, is I use comments to pseudocode. So what I mean by that is I basically put comments, like you can see down here, to say the steps that I'm gonna do, and then I fill up underneath that the code. And this is like the most amazing thing I've ever discovered, like I learned really early on, and it's helped me so much, is that if you do this, then if you write these comments in here, like read in data file, drop unneeded columns, ID is improperly read, make it a string, right? So I'm kind of like mentally going through, and then I write the code underneath there, and then it's already documented when I'm done with the code. The worst thing I have is like if I write the code and then document afterwards, I'm like, I already did all the work, but now I have to go back and actually like do all these extra comments. Trust me, like, I mean, it's worked well for me. Maybe you find it not worth it, but I think this is like the most amazing thing that like I've done, and it's saved me so much time, and it makes my code really nice and easy to read. Okay, cool. Any questions about this keeping organized code and everything?
You're saying there's setting just to print visualizations and markdowns in Jupyter.
Yeah, like you can export specifically like ignore code cells and stuff. We can talk about that definitely for office hours, like exactly how you can do this. But it's something I've done in the past, and it's really useful at times because you can hide the code output, and it makes it like less intimidating and less clunky for someone who might not really care about the code.
Cool.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. All right.
Sorry, also
so,
just trying to remember, docstring is literally just when you put like a note within your function, right? And I think it's just like a 3 commas or 3 double commas. I mean, quotes.
Quotes, yeah, that's right. It's technically any string right after the function's defined, but in general, you use 3 quotes because then you can do multi-line strings. So it's actually just a string underneath the function definition. But usually we'll use like 3 quotes because then you can write this big old long string.
Gotcha, thanks.
No problem. Cool. Anything else about keeping your notebook organized? I think I'm going to spend I spent some extra time doing this because I think it's super important. And when it's done well, it makes you stand out really well.
Oh, sorry, I guess one more thing.
Yeah.
So would it be not terrible to think of writing your Jupyter notebook kind of like a lesson on Learn, just like a paragraph and then code explaining and then like a paragraph?
Yeah, you can definitely, like, you can think of like the Learn like curriculum kind of like basically doing that. So just know your audience of who you're talking to. Cool. Awesome. All great things. All right, so let's see here, 15 minutes. Yeah, we'll see if we can get through all this stuff, right? Of course, we got office hours in the future too. But narratives, right? I will keep emphasizing narratives, right? I think I've shown this picture before that I kind of put together. Is basically your job as a data scientist is you are giving a story, you're giving basically something someone can take in, the insights, and actually do actionable things on it, right? So the reader should follow your thought process from top to bottom. So you want to make it clear what your next steps are. So kind of like what I said with markdown cells, it's like you have a visualization, you have exploratory visualization, or doing a df.describe or whatever. Underneath that should be a markdown that says what you're trying to do, why is it important, okay? And that should flow more like from the top bottom. Note that your final product, right, the final thing you write, it might not be literally what you did. You might have spent grueling hours of exploring different parts and then you find this gold nugget. Like, I'm sorry to say this, right? But like, it's probably not important for you to talk about the grueling hours to find that gold nugget. All people really care about, your stakeholders, is that gold nugget. Maybe there's some parts that are relevant of why you got to this point, but make sure it's coherent and stuff. And this is where I think you have to really put yourself in their shoes. Is like, what do they care about? And sometimes that's not exactly what you might care about the most, but you have to keep that in mind. Okay, cool. And then remember this is about the technical piece, right? Your conversations with a data-minded person. So this will be like with the instructor, whether it's me, Eli, or whoever. Know that basically this person is someone who is familiar with data science. You can think of it like they, what's it called? Like, how do I say this? There's someone like who is familiar with data scientists. They might be data scientists themselves. You can think of a data team manager or like your manager itself. I'm just gonna mute that right there. Just think of someone who's familiar with data, but not familiar with that specific data set. That makes sense? So like they understand the concept of data science, so you don't have to talk about this function, like this doesn't import from pandas. They don't need to know that. They know what import is. They can understand this part. They might know what pandas is and everything like that, but they might not know specifically the data set that you're pulling in or that API that you're using. This is going to be much more of a conversation. Usually when I do this, I might jump around a little bit. I might kind of, honestly, might cut you off a little bit and say, hey, that looks interesting, but can you go back to there? Or, oh, you can skip over this. Can we go over here and stuff like that? Like, why do you do this? Like, I might do things like that and stuff like that. And so it's much more of a conversation. It doesn't have to be like a planned speech, project presentation. It's going to be much more of a natural kind of like you talking about what you've done and what you've seen. Okay, cool. All right. Hopefully that kind of makes things a little clearer. Any questions on this for this technical piece, their Jupyter Notebook? Pretty cool. Right. One thing I will add in here is that this is where I think sometimes people say like, oh, I took this notebook and I put it into different notebooks. You can split your technical notebook into multiple notebooks. I personally am not a fan of it. I think it's just like, it makes sense for a lot of times just to make one big Jupyter notebook because it kind of flows a little better. You don't have to worry about like passing in data and stuff like this. So one thing to alleviate that is you can see here, I'm using different headers and stuff like this. And so using different headers can help you really organize like what you're talking about. So you can think of like each main header as like, oh, here's the data acquisition stage. You don't have to literally say data acquisition or data mining or whatever, but you can kind of break it down in these parts and like it helps break things apart. And we'll talk about this maybe in office hours, but this is actually an NB extension here of folding your code. So I love, you know, as you can see here, I don't have to have you guys look a bunch of this stuff, but you can see what we're going to talk about. This helps, you know, kind of build this up. And what's nice too, if you do this, and you have this extension, you can actually make a good table of contents automatically, which can also help your reader navigate your stuff. Okay, not good? All right, awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and close this notebook and we'll talk about presentation. And I got a lot to say about presentation. I only have 10 minutes because I do have something I have to head off to. So presentation, right? You all know this presentation, right? Where they just take a PowerPoint and they just read it. And I had a high school teacher that literally said, like, I don't know who asked this. This is high school, and one of my peers said, like, oh, you know, Gorski, are we going to have oral presentations? And I don't know who asked for this because, like, why would you want an oral presentation? But they asked it, and my teacher says, no, because I would rather roll in broken glass than listen to your presentations. And I think he was completely accurate. There's so many presentations, it's just like, it's painful for your soul. But you guys, all your presentations as data scientists, as communicators, will not be that, like, because you guys will know what to do and how to communicate effectively. So one thing I will say is that probably the biggest thing that stops a lot of people is they don't take into account of their time. So for this presentation, for the project, you really should shoot for about 5 minutes. Don't go too short. I think 3 minutes is on the rubric technically too short. So about 5 minutes, 8 minutes at the high end, 10 minutes at the absolute max. I don't think I've ever stopped anyone to a presentation, but I shouldn't have to. About 5 to 8 minutes is a good amount of time. So make sure you practice, make sure you're aware of how much time and also what's important to your stakeholders, okay? One thing I'll say, you are the subject of the presentation, not the slides. The slides help emphasize your points. You are really the thing that people are listening to. The way I can prove this to you is that you're not just turning in your slides, you're presenting this information, right? You're presenting this to someone. And if you could just turn in your slides and you don't need to, then that's just a report, like that's a written form, right? You are the real reason why you're doing this presentation. So everything else should emphasize your points, not you emphasizing this, the slide presentations. Does that make sense? Okay. Just beware of the wall of text, which is like the word for word, you know, reading it through and stuff like that. That just shows like you're not needed. If I can read everything and know everything about your presentation without you there, that's not a good sign, right? Okay. Less is more, but make it meaningful. So don't give it too much info, too many words, too much info in the visualizations. This is kind of like too many things going on in a visualization, or like there's a lot of extra details. That's the equivalent of having like a wall of text, right? You don't want a wall of text. You don't want to have multiple parts. You can have more slides to emphasize your points. So in the curriculum, it mentions about like 10 to 12 slides. I'm not going to count how many slides you have. Like, I don't care about how many slides you have. I'm just talking about how you present this information and is it meaningful and understandable. And I would actually say is that most of the time having more slides is actually making it a lot easier to understand. One thing I really don't like having is my little pet peeve is people will put a visualization and then bullet points. Why do I have a visualization and bullet points? You should give me the visualization and tell me about the visualization. Just point out, walk me through this visualization. And then if you want to say, okay, here's the things that you should emphasize on, have it on the next slide and say, here's the emphasized points. Maybe you can even on the next slide have bullet points with your visualization, but I should never see visualization and bullet points, because you know what I'm going to do as a person looking at your presentation? I'm going to ignore either one of those things. I'm going to either focus just on the visualization or just on the bullet points, but I'm going to miss the points that you're talking about. Does that make sense? Sorry. And these are obviously, I'm being a little like, you know, like, oh, this is definitely wrong. You can break rules, right? Like you find what works for you. Okay. consider your audience, right? So remember, they are non-technical. This is where you really have to think about, like, you're talking to people who are not, like, if you're non-technical, people who do not deal with data every single day, do not deal with data scientists every single day. So you really have to ask yourself, is this important to my audience? I have done this myself. I have like literally, I made this amazing, beautiful equation to split up the data, to split up segments and stuff like this for customers and stuff like this. And I presented this over to essentially like, like VPs and stuff like this, like, oh, like, like, hey, this is what you should do. Like, check out this equation. And the equation basically just confused people. And they said, like, they were just kind of like focused on the wrong thing. And I was just like, oh my God, no, like you're misunderstanding this. And like, I did the visualization the next slide and they're like, oh, this makes sense. And I was like, but the equation is so beautiful and awesome. And I love this math. You have to realize that you are not, the presentation is not for you. The presentation is for the people who are getting this information. So always keep that in mind. It's a very easy thing to forget, or at least, not gear your presentation towards them. Make sure you have actionable items. If you're getting insights, you should say what you should be able to do with these insights. You can say something along like, like, here's my finding, here's what you should do. But I will say is that at the end of your presentation, your recommendation should appear at the end of your presentation to re-emphasize, these are the things that you should do. Does that make sense? And note that this important information should be clear. If you have 3 recommendations, that should be, each slide has your recommendation, because those are really important things. The way I see it is that you can imagine like a slide. It's what everyone does when they see a slide. What do you guys do when you see a slide and like you're like in a conference or whatnot? The first thing you do, everyone writes down exactly what's on the slide, right? Like they start writing down furiously, like trying to get all the bullet points. So the problem is like, if you have a whole list of bullet points and you're writing that down furiously, you're not listening to the person talk and explain those parts. So turn that around and say, okay, here is my very quick, like recommendation, could be a sentence fragment and stuff like this. And you say, here's my presentation, here's my information. Sorry, just notice what time it is. Here's my recommendation. And there's just one quick, sentence fragment, essentially. They write that down and then they're listening to you the whole time. If you have all 3 of them in there, they're gonna write down all this stuff. And by the time they're done with it, you already moved on to the second recommendation and they missed what was important. So you just kind of take out the middleman and say, hey, here's my recommendation, 1 slide. You talk about it, next slide, recommendation. And it's the same amount of time, but it'll help kind of guide and emphasize to your audience what they're supposed to talk about. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. And then one thing I'll kind of put here is more accurate data does not mean clear data. We are really tempted as data scientists to make sure we provide all the information to a person and like say like, okay, and then emphasize these points. That doesn't mean it's clear. So sometimes, and this is where this might be a little controversial, sometimes it makes sense not to include all the data in the visualization to a non-technical person because it distracts from like what is actually important. One compromise, if you like are like, what, here's the full data, but like you really want to emphasize a certain point, you can have the full data like visualization, like imagine like a scatter plot, and then having like on the next slide or maybe even on that same slide, like a circle that's kind of says these are the things that are important, or like an arrow that says this is the thing that's important. And you should also, as the presenter, walk the person through of like, here's my visualization, this is what's important. So that's the kind of thing you want to do. You're guiding your audience through it. Okay, and sometimes it makes more sense to make a visualization that actually has less information just to emphasize your point. Okay. Cool. All right. Cool. All right. So I think, let's see here. We have about 3 minutes left. So I think I don't want to like take this whole time. I'll just kind of very briefly say that I have some overall advice for you guys. We'll go over this in an office hours maybe, because you guys won't be doing the presentation any time. But really quickly, just know each slide should contain each slide contains a single thought. Don't use more than 3 bullet points per slide. It just helps keep things condensed. Only use sentence fragments, and then use visuals and pictures to help tell a story. This, for example, is too much information, right? This is way too much. These are kind of my general rules that I personally think are really good. But of course, if you break it, if you have 4 bullet points on one slide, it's not the end of the world, right? If you use a sentence instead of a sentence fragment, it doesn't mean like you did a bad presentation. But I think if you kind of keep these general like rules, they help you make a cleaner and more focused presentation, okay? But I'll go into more detail. There's some extra information here, but we'll talk about that maybe another office hours. I just wanted to make sure I have enough time to talk about the video part and the blog part. So video, basically, don't stress about this. It's basically just for you to get more practice. It's for you to basically practice out this part. I don't want you to record it over and over and over again to make it perfect. Basically, what you should do is you have your presentation ready, you practice it a few times, and then you say, okay, I'm gonna do the recording. You do the recording of whatever your presentation is. You can use Zoom, you can use like Loom, you can use all these different, recording things, just to record your screen and the thing. It does not have to be a professional level. It just has to be basically you talking through your presentation as if you're like doing the assessment. You shouldn't have to do it more than once. Like if you like really mess up, you can go back and like do it again, but don't edit it. Don't like try to do like the perfect take of like 5 times, 6 times and whatnot. Basically just know it's there to, first of all, for your own practice, to make sure you practice it and know how much time it takes. And also, what's it called? Also helps us document just like, you're like, oh, this is the person's presentation, because it's not just the slides. Okay. All right. And then the last one is the blog. Basically, you are presenting yourself, online presence. You don't have to be an expert writer. You don't have to be great at writing blogs. Some suggestions that I have is make sure you focus on one technical aspect of your project versus like talking about the whole project in your blog. It just helps kind of make things a little clearer where things get a little more watered down to try talking about your whole project. If you talk about one aspect, maybe using API calls or talking about cleaning data or visualization, like if you talk about one aspect of your project, that will usually be really helpful. And you want to be more technical. You want to have someone to understand what you are trying to say. Or like, sorry, that you are someone who's data minded. Okay, cool. Yeah, all right, sound pretty good. I do have to head out, but are there any like really burning questions right now?
Just a quick one for the video. Do you just basically record what you're gonna do on the presentation and then just do the presentation when it's done?
Yeah, it's literally like, you can think of like when you do your presentation in your assessment, that's what the video recording is.
Gotcha.
Okay, and just the non-technical, not the full technical piece, right? Just it should be about like 5, at most 10 minutes long.
Okay.
Okay,
Thanks.
cool. All right, everyone. And we'll talk more about this in office hours and stuff like that. I do have to head out, but if you guys have questions, turn on Slack. Okay.